It had been years since Sarah had truly felt seen. In the mirror, she observed the reflection of a woman who, despite the passing of time, still carried traces of her youth. She was in her early 30s, but her eyes, soft yet shadowed with an unspoken weariness, told a different story. The lines around her mouth deepened ever so slightly when she smiled, a reminder of the years spent not just living but enduring. Her face, once youthful and fresh, now bore the quiet signs of motherhood, of love, of hardship, and of solitude. Her body was different now too, softer around the edges. She was proud of the curves that had arrived with motherhood, but the truth was that they were also a reflection of something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface, something fragile that she rarely allowed others to see. Her husband, David, had once been her great love. Their meeting had been a spark, a sudden connection that seemed to promise forever. But that promise had shifted over time, worn by the weight of long nights and far-flung highways. David was a truck driver. It had been his job, the one that had allowed them to live a comfortable life, but it had also been the one that had slowly drained the intimacy from their marriage. He was gone so often, his time spent on endless roads, delivering goods to places she would never see, places she didn't even care to know about. When he was home, it was always a brief and hurried moment, a fleeting touch in the space between his comings and goings. His hands, worn and calloused from gripping the wheel, held a tenderness when they touched her, but it was the tenderness of someone who had been away too long, whose attention was never fully present. He loved her, she knew that, but it was a quiet love, a steady, dependable kind of love that never burned with the intensity it once had. Sarah had tried to make peace with the life she had. She had tried to fill the empty hours with things that should have mattered, with the rhythm of daily routines, cooking, cleaning, raising their two children. But as time passed, she found that the quiet spaces between the tasks began to grow longer, more unbearable. It wasn't that she didn't love her children, of course. They were her heart. But motherhood, with its endless demands, was a lonely kind of love. They needed her, but they didn't need her in the way that David once had, not in the way that a husband needs a wife. Her children were growing, becoming their own little people, and though she cherished them, a part of her was constantly adrift, trying to hold on to something that had slipped out of reach. It was especially difficult on the days when David was gone for long stretches. The silence in the house became suffocating. Even with the noise of the children, the house felt empty. There were no conversations to fill the quiet, no laughter shared between them. She would sit in the living room, looking at the clock, watching as the minutes ticked by, wondering when the loneliness would finally become too much to bear. She told herself it wasn't that bad that she had been strong for so long, but deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. There were nights when she would stare out the window at the way the moonlight hit the snow-covered ground, and she would feel the ache of longing deep inside her. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was a longing for something that had once been so full of life but had gradually drained away. A yearning for a connection that no longer existed in the way it once had. Christmas was always a time that accentuated her feelings of isolation. The house would be decorated in twinkling lights, the smell of pine and cinnamon would fill the air, and yet, without David by her side, the season lost its meaning. She had never been one to expect grand gestures or extravagant gifts, but she had always hoped for something more, a shared moment, a simple gesture of affection that reminded her that her husband saw her, that he knew her beyond the woman who kept the house in order and cared for the children. But David was always gone. The long haul had become part of their marriage, part of the fabric of their relationship, and she had long since stopped hoping for anything different. This year, Christmas Eve was no different. David had kissed her goodbye that morning, promising he would be home in time for Christmas dinner. But she knew the reality. The long haul of driving, the late-night roads, the long hours spent in the cab of his truck, she would be alone, just as she had been so many times before. She had tried to make herself busy, cleaning, preparing the house for Christmas, but her mind kept wandering back to the absence that seemed to linger like a shadow over everything. The house, despite the warmth of the fire she had built, felt colder than it had in a long time. Her children were with her, but they were absorbed in their own world, the excitement of the season pulling them away from her, as it should. And so, she sat there alone in the quiet, wrapped in the soft glow of the Christmas lights, and for the first time in a long while, she felt as though the weight of her solitude might crush her. The night was stormy, a fierce wind howling outside, rattling the old windows of the house. Snow fell thick and heavy, obscuring everything outside, creating a world that was both beautiful and desolate. Sarah tried to read, tried to distract herself, but the weight of the emptiness around her kept pulling her back into herself. She couldn't escape it. She had learned to fill her days, to numb the pain of loneliness with routine, but at night, in the stillness, the absence of David pressed down on her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. And that's when she saw it. A dark figure moved across the snow, just beyond the reach of the dim light that filtered through the window. At first, Sarah thought it was a trick of her tired eyes, but as she focused, the shape grew clearer. It was a horse, its body trembling against the cold, its mane whipping violently in the wind. Sarah's heart clenched. The sight of the animal, struggling in the snow, struck a chord deep within her. It wasn't just that it was a living being in need of help, it was more than that. It was a kindred spirit, lost and alone, just like her. Without thinking, she stood up and hurried to the door, grabbing her coat and boots. The cold bit at her as she stepped outside, the wind howling in her face, the snow stinging her skin. She didn't care. She couldn't leave it out there. She approached the horse carefully, her heart racing as she reached out a hand to steady it. The animal's wide eyes looked back at her, filled with a kind of helplessness that mirrored her own. She murmured softly, trying to calm it, her voice a gentle balm in the midst of the storm. "It's okay," she said, her words more to herself than to the horse. "You're safe now." As she guided the horse toward the warmth of the house, Sarah felt a strange sense of purpose wash over her. She wasn't just helping an animal, she was doing something that mattered. The loneliness, the ache that had been gnawing at her all evening, seemed to recede as she focused on the horse, on the task of caring for it. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel quite so alone. But what Sarah didn't know then, what she could never have anticipated, was that this simple act of kindness, this moment of connection, would change the course of her life forever. The snow fell in soft, swirling gusts, blanketing the earth beneath a veil of pristine white. The cold was fierce, cutting through the night like an invisible blade. Sarah stood at the door for a moment, her breath visible in the frigid air, heart racing with something unfamiliar. It wasn't just the sudden urgency to help the animal that was striking her, it was the sense of something larger, something almost surreal unfolding before her eyes. It felt as though the world, with all its long hours and empty silences, had conspired to bring her here, to this moment. The horse, its dark shape now clearer in the driving snow, was struggling against the storm. It was a large animal, its coat matted and sodden from the relentless snowfall. Its legs were stiff, and it moved slowly, as if the weight of the cold had worn down its strength. The horse's mane whipped around its face like a tangle of black threads, its tail flicking through the air as though trying to swat away the cold that clung to its body. Sarah's chest tightened. She could see its breath short, shallow gasps as the creature tried to push forward, its body trembling violently from the chill. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. The wind howled around her, making the familiar world outside her door feel foreign, harsh, and unwelcoming. She was alone in the house, with only her thoughts and the occasional noise of her children playing in the background. David, her husband, was miles away, driving the long highways that separated him from her, just as they had been separated in so many ways before. But in this moment, with the cold seeping through her bones and the horse before her, none of that mattered. The emptiness she had grown accustomed to felt distant now, replaced by something much more immediate. The creature needed help. It needed her. Stepping into the snow, her boots crunching beneath her, Sarah moved toward the horse. Each step was careful, tentative, but there was a determination behind it. The snow stung her skin, and the wind cut through her thin coat, but she hardly noticed. All she could think of was the horse, its desperate eyes, its trembling body. When she reached it, the horse stood still, looking at her with wide, dark eyes. It didn't move, didn't flinch, as though it had already resigned itself to whatever fate the storm had in store for it. Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached out to touch its side. The horse was cold, its coat stiff with the weight of the snow. There was a raggedness to its breathing, a sort of exhaustion that weighed on her heart. It was a feeling she recognized too well, though in her case the weariness was one born of months and years, not ours. It's okay, Sarah whispered, though the words seemed to have little power in the face of such unrelenting cold. I'll take care of you. She ran her hand along the animal's side, feeling the tension in its muscles, the tightness of hunger and exhaustion that seemed to wrap around the horse's ribs. Slowly, gently, she coaxed the horse forward, leading it toward the house. There was an instinctive pull in her chest, a quiet calling to protect this creature, to offer it some solace, some small comfort against the storm. The horse allowed her to lead it, its steps slow and unsteady, but it followed her all the way to the door. Once inside, Sarah immediately went to work. The warmth of the house hit them both like a wave, the heat from the fire filling the room with an almost palpable relief. Sarah quickly moved to the garage, her mind focused solely on the animal, on what it might need. She had no experience with horses, no knowledge of their specific care, but she knew the basics: the warmth, the shelter, and most importantly, food and water. As the horse entered the garage, Sarah began to unbundle herself from her wet clothes, her body still shivering from the cold. She moved swiftly, efficiently, already thinking ahead to what the creature might need. First, she found an old blanket to drape over the horse, trying to warm its body as best as she could. She noticed the animal's ribs too prominent beneath its coat and felt a pang of guilt for not having noticed sooner. She could feel its skin beneath the layer of fur, brittle and thin, like paper stretched too tight. "Don't worry," she murmured, more to herself than to the horse. "I'm here now." The horse was still, its large eyes following her every move. There was something in its gaze that unsettled her, a deep, knowing stare, as though it saw more than she could ever comprehend. She wondered if she was projecting her own loneliness onto the animal. It was possible, after all. But then again, something in her told her the horse, too, had known loneliness. It had been out there alone, in the storm, for reasons Sarah could only guess. She hadn't seen anyone nearby, no rider or owner. Perhaps it had escaped, or perhaps it had been abandoned. But it didn't matter. It was here now, and she had a duty to care for it, to make it feel safe. As Sarah rummaged through her pantry, searching for something to feed the horse, her mind wandered. The storm had become a distant sound, a mere backdrop to the strange, almost surreal scene unfolding before her. She had never once considered bringing a horse into her home, let alone taking the time to care for it in such a way. But tonight it felt like the only thing that made sense. The weight of the loneliness she had been carrying for so long, the empty nights, the hollow conversations with David that seemed to grow more and more distant, it all seemed to dissipate in the presence of this creature. The horse didn't ask anything of her. It didn't speak, didn't expect anything in return. It simply stood there, its dark eyes trained on her, waiting. She found an old bag of apples at the back of the pantry and took it to the horse. She offered them cautiously at first, unsure of how it would respond. But the horse was gentle, even hungry. It took the apples from her hands, its teeth nipping gently at her fingers as it devoured the fruit. Sarah watched, transfixed, as it ate with quiet urgency, as though the warmth and food were exactly what it had been craving. While the horse ate, Sarah felt a strange impulse to speak. There was something about the animal's calm, its steadiness, that made her feel safe, made her feel that she could speak her thoughts aloud without fear of judgment. And so she did. She told the horse about David, about their life together. She spoke of the loneliness that had seeped into their marriage over the years, the endless hours of waiting for him to come home, only to have him leave again. She shared how the silence between them had grown so deep that she often found herself questioning if she had ever really known him at all. The horse's dark eyes never left her. It stood there in the garage, its head lowered, as if listening to every word she spoke. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to speak, why it felt so necessary to confess her heartache to a creature that couldn't understand her words. But somehow, the very act of speaking made the weight in her chest feel a little lighter. It was as though in the presence of this animal, her burden of silence and loneliness could finally be shared, even if only in the most unspoken way. As the hours passed, the horse grew calmer, its breathing steadying, its body warming beneath the blanket she had draped over it. Sarah sat down beside it, her back against the cold concrete wall of the garage, the soft glow of the Christmas lights from inside the house spilling in through the door. For a long time she simply sat there, her thoughts drifting, her body slowly unwinding in the quiet company of the horse. She didn't need to speak anymore. The silence between them was comfortable, even peaceful. There was something deeply comforting about it, something healing in the simplicity of the moment. Sarah didn't know what to call it. It wasn't love, at least not in the traditional sense. It was more of a shared understanding, a moment of connection that felt, in that instant, like all the answers she had been searching for. But the question lingered in her mind: was she helping the horse, or was it the horse that was helping her? The night grew colder still, the wind howling outside the house like some restless spirit, unrelenting in its fury. Inside, the warmth from the fire wrapped around Sarah like a faint comfort, though her thoughts remained distant, unsettled. The horse was now lying down on the floor of the garage, its body still trembling but no longer from the cold. It had taken its share of apples, and Sarah had made sure it had plenty of water. The storm outside continued its assault on the world, but within the house, a quiet tension simmered, growing heavier as the hours ticked by. Sarah sat in a chair in the corner of the garage, staring at the horse, her mind clouded by thoughts she couldn't seem to shake off. She wasn't sure why she had been so compelled to help the animal. It wasn't like her to take in a creature so unfamiliar, to risk so much for something that wasn't hers to care for. But there had been something in its eyes when she first saw it through the snowstorm, a raw, vulnerable gaze that seemed to speak to her in a way that words never had. She had been alone for so long. The silence in her home had settled like dust over her heart, and even the presence of David when he was there seemed distant. His long hours on the road, his quiet nature, the miles between them, it had all added up to a kind of loneliness that Sarah had tried so hard to ignore. But now, with the horse in her garage, something had shifted within her. She had allowed herself to care for it, to speak to it, and in doing so, had unknowingly opened a door inside her that she hadn't even realized was closed. She had shared her fears and frustrations with it, not out of expectation but out of something more primal, more desperate. It was as if, in that moment, she no longer felt invisible. The horse had listened, its dark eyes fixed on her, absorbing her words without judgment. For the first time in what felt like years, Sarah felt heard. The night was stretching on, and her thoughts were turning darker, more restless. She had been raised to believe in duty, in responsibility, in the quiet sacrifices that made up a life well lived. Her marriage to David had been a reflection of that. She had been the good wife, the one who supported him through thick and thin, who took care of the house, raised the children, kept the wheels of life turning while he drove across the country, delivering goods to people who would never know his name. She had always prided herself on her resilience, on the way she kept everything together. But beneath that pride, a quiet dissatisfaction had been growing for years, dissatisfaction that she had buried deep, beneath layers of smiles and polite conversations. David had always been dependable. He was the kind of man who would do anything for his family, and Sarah appreciated that. But his work had taken him away so often that it had become more of a habit than a choice. The quiet evenings spent alone had gradually become longer, the silences more profound. She had tried to fill them with things: books, television, the rhythmic motion of cleaning or cooking, but nothing seemed to fill the space where his presence had once been. The warmth of his body beside her, the sound of his voice, even the touch of his hand, those things had become distant memories, blurred by the passage of time. And then there was the touch of the horse. Sarah hadn't expected it. She hadn't expected to feel anything other than the cold, or the weariness, or perhaps even a moment of gratitude for the companionship she had been craving. But when she bent to feed the horse, the moment happened unexpected, uninvited, and all the more powerful for it. At first, she had only been focused on the task at hand. She had moved to the pile of apples she had found in the pantry, offering them one by one to the horse. Her hands had shaken slightly from the cold, but the action had been simple, practical. But then, as she had leaned closer to the animal, the horse had nuzzled against her, its warm breath brushing against her hand. She had flinched at first, surprised by the closeness, but then something strange had happened. The horse's breath had stirred something inside her, something deep, a longing that she hadn't known how to express, a yearning for something she had long forgotten. For a moment she had frozen. There was a pause in time, as if the world had held its breath. She had looked into the horse's eyes, dark, unblinking, filled with an ancient knowing that seemed to understand the depths of her own isolation. She hadn't wanted it to happen. She hadn't even recognized the warning signs within herself. But in that moment, she had let her guard down. The loneliness had filled the space between them, a silent invitation that neither of them had actively extended, but both had accepted. The horse nuzzled her again, its movements gentle at first, but gradually more insistent. Sarah's heartbeat quickened as she felt the animal's warmth seep into her body. It wasn't sexual, not exactly, but it was something more primal, something that stirred within her a forgotten part of herself, an ache that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. There, in that dimly lit garage, surrounded by the storm outside and the stillness of the house, Sarah let herself be touched by the horse. She closed her eyes, allowing the sensation to wash over her. The touch was soft, yet there was something about it that felt powerful, undeniable. She felt its warmth, its breath, the sense of something familiar, something comforting. The horse wasn't asking anything of her, it didn't need her to do anything. It was merely there, existing, and in its presence, Sarah felt seen. In that moment, it was as though the entire world had receded, and all that remained was her and the horse, a strange and fragile connection that neither could name. Her fingers brushed against its coat, feeling the heat radiating from the animal's body. She reached out to touch it again, this time with more intention, her fingers lingering along its back. She wasn't thinking clearly, wasn't considering the consequences of her actions. All she knew was that she needed something, anything, to fill the emptiness that had been gnawing at her for so long. The coldness of her life had settled so deeply inside her, she didn't know how to escape it. She hadn't realized how much she craved this feeling, this warmth, this closeness, this quiet companionship. And then, as if by instinct, she bent lower, her hands brushing against the animal's side. There was a moment of hesitation. She should stop. She knew she should, but the desire was overwhelming, and her body moved without her consent. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the horse shifted closer to her, its body pressing against hers with a sense of urgency. She closed her eyes, her mind racing, but the loneliness inside her had taken on a life of its own, and she found herself caught in a moment of weakness, a moment of surrender. The world outside seemed to disappear. There was no storm, no house, no family, only the warmth of the horse, the press of its body against hers, and the strange, overwhelming need to be touched, to be seen. In the quiet of the garage, Sarah let herself feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, a fleeting connection, a release, a moment of belonging. She had crossed a line, one she could never uncross, and though a small part of her screamed for her to stop, she couldn't. When the moment passed, when the urgency of the feeling had faded, Sarah found herself standing in the dim light of the garage, breathless and shaken. The horse was calm now, resting once again, its eyes closed. She was left standing there, hands trembling, her mind whirling with disbelief. She couldn't understand what had just happened, couldn't make sense of the overwhelming flood of emotions that had overtaken her. All she knew was that something inside her had broken. Something had shifted, and she wasn't sure if she could ever put it back together again. She stepped back, her chest tight, her heart racing. The weight of what she had just done settled over her like a heavy fog, and she could already feel the first tendrils of regret creeping into her thoughts. What had she done? What was she even thinking? The guilt was almost suffocating, and yet there was a part of her that couldn't bring herself to walk away from it. For the first time in years, she felt as though she had let something in, something dark, something dangerous. And in that moment, Sarah knew, deep down, that there was no turning back. The snowstorm had finally passed. The relentless wind that had been howling through the night, battering the house and rattling the windows, had now subsided into a haunting stillness. The pale, weak light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the curtains, casting long, fragile shadows across the room. Outside, the world was coated in a pristine layer of snow, untouched, shimmering as if the earth had been swept clean by the night's fury. It was a quiet, peaceful morning on the surface, at least. But inside Sarah's mind, there was no peace. The events of the previous night played out like an inescapable loop. She had barely slept, tossing and turning beneath the weight of her own guilt. The memories of the horse's touch still fresh against her skin, the sound of its breath in the quiet garage echoing in her ears. Each time she closed her eyes, the image of the animal's dark eyes stared back at her, as if it had seen through the very fabric of her being. She had given in to a moment of weakness, and she knew, deep within her, that she would never be able to undo what had been done. There were no second chances, no going back. The guilt was a constant companion now, a heavy weight that seemed to press down on her chest with every breath. It suffocated her, twisted her insides, and gnawed at her like a relentless animal. She could feel it, see it in the corners of her mind, taste it on her tongue every time she tried to think about her husband David, the man she had promised to love, honor, and cherish. And yet, in a moment of loneliness and desperation, she had betrayed him. The thought made her stomach turn, her heart ache. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't forget it. David had left the night before, just like any other night before a long haul. He had kissed her on the forehead as he always did, promising he would be home by Christmas dinner. He hadn't known what was coming. He couldn't have known. The thought of him out there, somewhere on the open road, miles away from their home, filled Sarah with an overwhelming sense of longing, of sadness. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve her weakness, her betrayal. He didn't deserve to be left in the dark while she carried a secret so heavy it might crush her under its weight. But it was too late now. She had heard the familiar rumble of the truck engine long before the headlights pierced the darkened driveway. She knew it was him. She had been waiting for him, watching the driveway with a nervous anticipation that she couldn't shake. When the truck pulled up, the sound of its engine dying down, Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Her heart began to race. This was the moment. This was when everything would either crumble or hold together, and Sarah wasn't sure she could bear the weight of either outcome. David stepped out of the truck, his large frame casting a shadow against the snow, the outline of his figure blurred by the rising steam from the exhaust. He was tired, of course he always was when he came back from a long trip, but there was something else about him today, something that Sarah couldn't quite place. The weariness in his movement seemed more pronounced. The way he stretched his shoulders before walking toward the door felt heavier than usual. His hands were stained with oil and dirt, the remnants of a long haul, and there was a faint scent of truck stop coffee that clung to him like a familiar afterthought. "Hey, babe," he greeted her, his voice deep and rough but warm. "I'm home." He smiled as he walked in, pulling Sarah into an embrace, his arms enveloping her like a shield against the cold. She clung to him, her body trembling in his arms, but not from the cold. No, the tremor that ran through her was something far more terrible, something far more unsettling. "Hey," she replied, her voice shaky. She buried her face in his chest, unwilling to look him in the eye, afraid that if she did, he would somehow see the truth written on her face. The guilt was so thick, so suffocating, that it felt like it was spilling out of her pores, threatening to choke her. She pulled away after a moment, trying to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "What's this?" David asked, looking over her shoulder toward the garage. Sarah's stomach lurched when she saw his gaze follow the path to the open door, where the horse was resting quietly inside, its dark eyes half closed, its head turned toward the doorway, as if waiting for something or someone. Sarah's heart stopped. The horse had become a symbol of her guilt, its silent presence in the garage a constant reminder of the choices she had made. It was there, like a witness to her secret, a reminder of her weakness. And now David would see it. He would question it. He would ask, and she didn't know how to answer. "It's a Christmas gift," Sarah blurted out before she could stop herself. She winced as soon as the words left her mouth. It sounded weak, even to her own ears, and she immediately regretted them. But David didn't seem to notice. He chuckled. A soft, affectionate sound. "A gift?" For me, he stepped closer to the garage door, peering inside with a raised eyebrow. "You didn't have to do all this, Sarah. You're always going overboard with surprises." "I thought it might be nice," she replied, forcing a smile, but the words felt hollow. How could she lie to him like this? How could she pretend everything was fine when inside she was unraveling? David's face softened, and he walked over to her, pulling her into another embrace. "You didn't have to. I'm just happy to be home with you." The warmth of his hug, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the comforting weight of his body against hers, it should have been a relief. But instead, it only served to heighten the tension within her. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to confess, to come clean, to tell him what had happened. But the words wouldn't come. She couldn't bring herself to ruin everything. Not yet. The thought of losing him, of seeing the hurt in his eyes, was more than she could bear. "I missed you," she whispered, closing her eyes, trying to silence the voice in her head that told her she was a liar, that she was a fraud. She had betrayed him, and no amount of words or apologies could ever take that back. David smiled softly, his lips brushing against her forehead. "I missed you too." It's been a long few weeks. He stepped back and looked at her, his eyes gentle, full of the trust that had always been there between them. That trust, which Sarah now felt she had shattered beyond repair. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her racing heart. She had to hold it together. For David, for their family. But the guilt was a tide she couldn't escape, and the weight of it dragged her under with every passing second. She hadn't realized how much she had needed him until he was standing right in front of her. And yet, the moment he returned, she realized how much she had already lost. As the evening wore on, and they sat down for a quiet dinner, Sarah found herself watching David more closely than usual. She couldn't stop herself. She noticed the small lines on his face, the way his hands seemed to move a little slower, the exhaustion in his eyes. He was there, but not entirely. There was something different in him, something she couldn't name, but something that reminded her of the distance between them. She felt it in every conversation, every glance. He didn't know. He didn't suspect. But she did. The regret built up inside her, a quiet storm that swirled in her chest. How could she face him, knowing what she had done? How could she look at him and pretend everything was normal? It felt like a lie, and each moment she held it in place made her feel smaller, weaker, more invisible. And so they ate in silence, the weight of the unspoken words hanging over them like a dark cloud. David smiled, laughed at the children's jokes, and Sarah pretended to be okay. But deep down, she knew nothing would ever be the same. She had crossed a line, and now, no matter how hard she tried to hide it, the truth would always find its way to the surface. The clock ticked on, the minutes stretching into hours, and the house that had once felt like a home now felt like a prison. She could feel the walls closing in around her, suffocating her with the knowledge that she had betrayed the one person who trusted her above all else. The days after the storm passed felt strangely heavier than before, as if the weight of the world had settled upon Sarah's shoulders, pressing down with an intensity she had never known. The house, once filled with the sounds of a life she had created with David, now felt distant, hollow. She went about her routines as she always had, but it was as though she were moving through a fog, each step a little more difficult than the last. The guilt was a constant companion, its presence suffocating, a cold and oppressive shadow that followed her every move. The horse had become a silent witness to her secret. Its dark eyes, always so calm and understanding, seemed to reflect back at her every moment of weakness. Every time Sarah walked into the garage to check on it, her heart would tighten with a mixture of regret and shame. It was still there, nestled quietly in the corner of the garage, the same place it had rested since that fateful night. But now it wasn't just the horse that she had to contend with, it was everything. Every time she passed by the spot where the horse lay, a wave of nausea would rise in her throat, the memories of that moment flooding back with such force that it felt impossible to escape them. She had tried to keep her composure. She had to. For David. For their family. But each passing day felt like a countdown, a reminder that the truth was eventually going to come to the surface. She couldn't keep the lie hidden forever. No matter how hard she tried to bury it, the truth had taken root deep inside her, like a festering wound that no amount of bandages could cover. David had returned from his trip on Christmas Eve, just as he had promised, weary from the long hours on the road, but his eyes still warm with the familiar comfort that always filled him when he returned home. He had smiled when he walked through the door, his heavy boots leaving tracks in the snow that still clung to his clothes. He had immediately noticed the horse in the garage, his brow furrowing with a mixture of surprise and amusement. "You didn't have to go all out like this," he had said, his voice light and filled with affection. "But it's a good thing you brought it inside. Looks like it's been through a lot." He had pulled Sarah into a hug then, holding her close, his arms wrapping around her as though he hadn't just spent days driving across the country, away from her, from their home. And Sarah, in that moment, had let herself fall into the embrace. A brief flicker of comfort amidst the storm of her guilt. But it hadn't lasted long. As she stood there in his arms, the guilt gnawed at her insides like an animal, relentless and unforgiving. She knew that she was no longer the woman he thought she was. The truth of what she had done, the betrayal she had allowed to happen, weighed on her chest with such force that it felt like her ribs might crack under the pressure. But she couldn't tell him. Not then, not now. She couldn't bring herself to confess, couldn't find the words to explain the depths of her mistake. David had settled back into his familiar rhythm after that. He had unloaded his things, put the kettle on, and they had sat down to a quiet meal together. It should have been a peaceful evening, a celebration of their shared life. But instead, Sarah found herself unable to fully engage. Every time she looked at him, she saw the trust in his eyes, the unspoken belief that he could rely on her, that their life together was solid and unshakable. And in that moment, all she could see was the lie she had built around herself, the false front she had presented to him. That night, as they lay in bed together, the warmth of his body beside hers was like a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. The silence between them felt so much deeper than it had ever been before. It wasn't just the quiet of the night, it was the quiet of a secret, of a gap that had opened between them and she had no idea how to bridge it. The physical space between them, the miles that had separated them for so long when David had been on the road, had been nothing compared to the emotional distance that had grown now. It felt insurmountable, as if some invisible wall had risen between them, and Sarah wasn't sure if she would ever be able to tear it down. In the dark, she turned away from him, her eyes wide open, staring into the shadows that filled the room. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Her mind raced with thoughts of that night in the garage, the heat of the horse's breath, the vulnerability that had led her to make that terrible decision. She had betrayed him, and the weight of that betrayal was unbearable. How could she ever look him in the eye again? How could she face him after what she had done? But she didn't have to answer those questions. Not yet. Not until the right moment came, and she wasn't ready for that moment. So she stayed silent, her body frozen in the bed beside him, her mind racing, torn between the need to confess and the overwhelming fear of the consequences. She was too afraid to lose everything, too afraid of the irreversible damage the truth might cause. In the days that followed, Sarah's guilt deepened. She couldn't escape it. It followed her everywhere, through the kitchen, through the living room, into the garden when she watered the plants. It was there in every conversation she had with David, in every gesture, every smile. It was as though her very presence was now tainted by the weight of her actions, and she couldn't undo it, no matter how hard she tried. She continued to care for the horse, though the sight of it only served as a reminder of what she had allowed to happen. She fed it, cleaned its stall, and even whispered apologies to it when no one was around. But it was the animal's quiet presence that seemed to mock her. It had been there when her weaknesses had taken hold, when she had given in to her darkest impulses. It had been there in her moment of surrender, and now it stood as a living testament to her shame. David, on the other hand, seemed blissfully unaware of the turmoil that was tearing at his wife's soul. He was content, as always, in his own way. He worked hard, came home tired, and loved her in the way he knew how, steadily, reliably, without question. It was a love she had always taken for granted, a love that had been the foundation of their life together. But now, as Sarah looked at him, she saw the innocence in his eyes, the unspoken trust, and it tore her apart. She couldn't keep lying to him, but she also couldn't find the courage to tell him the truth. Every time she thought about confessing, the fear tightened in her chest. What if he left her? What if the damage was too great to repair? What if everything she had built with him, everything they had shared, was lost forever because of one moment of weakness, one lapse in judgment? And so, she continued to live with the weight of her regret, letting it weigh on her like a burden she could never fully release. It was there in every interaction, in every glance, in every touch. It became a part of her, a shadow she couldn't shake, no matter how much she wanted to. The guilt wrapped around her like chains, each day tightening just a little more, each night heavier than the last. But the worst part was not just the guilt. It was the silence, the unspoken knowledge that she was living a lie, that her marriage, her life with David, was built on something she had tarnished. The weight of regret was not just the fear of losing everything, it was the realization that she had already lost something. She had lost herself, and she didn't know how to find her way back.